Good evening. I think we're ready to begin. I'd like to say a happy welcome to all of you. My name is Father White, Thomas Joseph White, and I'm the rector of the university, and we're, of course, very happy and very privileged to be hosting this event. There'll be more formal words about the engagement tonight, but I have a few opening remarks. We're in the midst of a conversation between Catholics and Jews taking place between esteemed scholars that takes place over a number of days, and this is the public lecture in the midst of that event. So let me just say a few words first of introduction about Jewish-Catholic dialogue at the Angelicum. The university is happy to have been for many years a center of research and academic conversation that contributes to living Jewish-Catholic relations. We're grateful that this conversation takes place in the geographic and historical center of the Catholic Church here in Rome, in a university with roots in the Dominican intellectual tradition that has its remote origins 800 years ago in the studium of the order first established in Rome by St. Thomas Aquinas himself, and which was also the intellectual home of Karol Wojtyla during the time of his Roman education in the mid-20th century. Of course, as Pope John Paul II, he was a remarkable influence in the advance and evolution of Jewish-Catholic relations over the course of the past 70 years. I'd like to thank Professor Adam Afterman for his work on behalf of the John Paul II Center for Interreligious Studies here at the Angelicum and the Russell Berry Foundation for their support and work to help us with this event. I'm grateful to Father Hyacinth Destivel from the Institute of Ecumenical Studies at the university for his help in organizing and sponsoring this event. And finally, I'd like to thank Professor Gavin DaCosta, who has recently joined the faculty and is contributing thematically to the development of our theological conversation between Jews and Christians in the university in the years to come, and who helped organize all the thematics of the conference. Allow me a few theoretical comments that will remain brief. We live in an epoch of secularization, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe and North America to be sure. As once historically influential religious communities of Christians and Jews experience a socially diminished, or at least a culturally questioned influence, we are likely to see a return by practicing Catholic Christians and Jews to resources of traditional identity, Talmudic observation, the study of the fathers, Talmudic observance, the study of the fathers of the church, and traditional liturgical and social and spiritual practices of the respective communities. This is normal to some extent, because when identity seems under threat, one has recourse to the resources of traditional resources for insisting on identity and recovering it. But this recent trend in religious reflexive self-protection should not become the occasion to renew older antipathies, distrusts, or unproductive forms of mutual intellectual exclusion. In this context, Jewish-Catholic conversation is important for several reasons. One of them is to retain and advance the acquisitions of mutual understanding of the recent past that have developed in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. However, there are also deeper, long-standing thematic reasons we can mention as well. Namely, theologically, Jews and Christians have always and will forever retain a common set of theological beliefs about divine revelation, at least insofar as they are not simply culturally Catholic or Jewish, but always animated by some sector of their respective communities who are drawn to the religious claims therein. God has spoken through the prophets, as the New Testament letter to the Hebrews states. The law, the prophets, and the wisdom writings of the scriptures continue to shine out into the world and to influence the life of the human community. Christians and Jews have a shared consensus in the midst of their differences on this point. The God of Israel is the God of the nations. Second, a more humanistic point, but one that's also very significant. Jews and Christians have a common place in human culture as a dialogical source of intellectual, ethical, religious, and artistic thinking, in law, ethics, metaphysics, and the shared search for a political life of hope and inclusion. Just as one might face a culture or cultures that intentionally exclude Jewish voices or Christian voices, so one can cultivate a receptivity to the Judeo-Christian intellectual and cultural tradition or traditions in the larger forum of human society, and in doing so, advance a recovery of the historical memory and a deeper humanistic and ethical ethos in those cultures. Finally, unfortunately, Jews and Christians share a common history of mutual intolerance and violence, the majority of which has been perpetuated by various forms of Christian anti-Judaism or Christian anti-Semitism, both in the medieval and modern era. Jewish-Catholic conversations aim to confront and ward off new and old forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, and to recall the horrors of the Shoah, lest there be an intentional or unintentional forgetfulness of the horror of modern anti-Semitism. They also seek to purify the memory and heal and elevate the mutual regard of each community toward one another in friendship, justice, and hope. However, even in this history that's marked by grave abuses against human dignity, there are real opportunities for the future. Catholics and Jews both have a vested interest in a deeper acknowledgement of the universal human dignity of persons made in the image of God, and of recognition of the rights of persons that can be articulated in modern legal and democratic forms, so that they can work together to help the wider world to be a leaven to all the nations, and even to bring the light of the law and the light of the gospel to all peoples. Indeed, the Catholic Church cannot fail to perceive, even in the most ordinary Jewish-Catholic relations, the hope of something eschatological. Thank you to all the speakers and participants at this event for your contributions to this dialogue at the Angelicum. Welcome or welcome back to our university. We're so grateful to have you here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Thomas Joseph White, for your kind words of introduction and for setting the stage for the discussion that we are going to have, thanks to the two great scholars and practitioners of Jewish-Christian dialogue that I have next to me on the stage, and that I will present in a minute. But thank you also to all the participants and to the wonderful international group that we have today in the audience, because as Father Thomas Joseph White was mentioning, this public lecture is taking place in the midst of a conference we are having, discussing in depth issues of Jewish-Catholic dialogue with Jewish and Catholic scholars coming from Europe, Israel, and the United States. I'm Elena Dini. I'm the Senior Program Manager of the John Paul II Center for Interreligious Dialogue, and I'm really happy to start introducing the first speaker next to me, who is Professor Karma Ben Yohanan. She teaches at the Department for Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Previously, she held the chair of Jewish-Christian Relations in the Faculty of Theology at the Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, where she served until the summer of 2022, and was a visiting professor at the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies at the Gregorian University here in Rome. Her first book, Jacob's Younger Brother, examines the intra-Catholic discourse on Jews and Judaism after Vatican II, and the intra-Jewish Orthodox view on Christians and Christianity after the Holocaust, and the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948. The book was awarded the Shazar Prize for Research on Jewish History, the Polonsky Prize for Creativity and Originality in the Humanities, and, as was just announced a few days ago, the Dan David Prize for Historical Research. congratulations, first of all, Professor Ben Yohanan, and we look so much forward to hearing your thoughts and have you starting the conversation on today's topic, Roman Catholics and Jews after Vatican II, taking stock for the future. And Professor Ben Yohanan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here today with us. Before attempting to conduct a pseudo-prophetic leap into the future of Jewish-Christian dialogue, please allow me to express my deepest gratitude to my dear friends and colleagues who organized this evening and who invest much intellectual and spiritual energy in moving Jewish-Christian dialogue forward. To Gavin Da Costa and Adam Afterman, where are you, Adam? Okay. To Father Thomas Joseph White, to Elena Dini, and to Anna Petrarche, to the entire Angelicum community, to the John Paul II Center for Interreligious Dialogue and the Russell Berry Foundation, and also to the Ecumenical Institute. I'm very excited to be here and talk about things close to the heart, at the very center of Roman Catholic theological scholarship, in a friendly atmosphere of trust and mutual enrichment. Thank you for making this possible. One more issue before we start. When we talk about the future, we express our hopes and our anxieties. You might have better things to do other than following the Israeli news, but it is important to note that for us Israelis, this is a time of deep anxiety, where everything we know about ourselves and about the world is changing, but the changes are too rapid for our intellectual and analytical skills to process at this point. I therefore recommend that you take what I will say here with a grain of salt, since my imagination is regrettably troubled at this time. So how shall we start? Let's start with the obvious. The history of Judaism, as the history of Christianity, is full of tides and ebbs. Moments of destruction and moments of hope, moments of confusion and moments of inspiration. If this is true for each one of the communities separately, it is even truer for their relationship. The history of Jewish-Christian relations has many faces. It mixes symbiosis and differentiation, distance and intimacy, competition and dependency, love and hate. We today are privileged to be living in the highest peak of this relationship, in a time where persistent, heated, and painful polemics have largely made room for friendly exchange and thoughtful dialogue, where members of both the Jewish and the Catholic communities went out of their ways to examine their own biases and open a new page for one of the most complicated relationships in history. This achievement is truly imaginary in its dimensions. Yet, as I will try to demonstrate in what follows, the effort required to maintain this achievement, and even more so to further cultivate it, is immense, and its success lays on our own shoulders. So, how did this achievement come about? What were the conditions which allowed Catholics and Jews to meet each other anew after such a tormented history and create the present moment? In the beginning, as the saying goes, was the Holocaust. The long history of European Jews had been abruptly and ferociously terminated. Around 6 million Jews were murdered. Others who were able to escape before the so-called final solution or managed to survive the effort of annihilation in Europe found new homes, mostly outside the continent, especially in mandatory Palestine, later called the State of Israel, and the United States. The Christian communities who witnessed the fate of their former neighbors in Europe were now searching for a language with which to think and speak of what had happened. The Jewish survivors were preoccupied with putting their lives together, asking themselves how to remember, how to conceptualize this breach within their history, and, more than anything else, with building a world in which a Holocaust would not be able to happen again. In the space between these two different projects, a tormenting question resonated. What was the connection between modern anti-Semitism and popular Christian images of Jews which circulated in Christian communities throughout the centuries? What roots led from the old rivalry between the ecclesia and the synagoga to these years of total destruction? And how can a new formulation of this relationship contribute to preventing something similar from occurring in the future? The question of the connection between the Holocaust and the history of Jewish-Christian relations has been the central, all-encompassing theme which arguably occupied or burdened every Jewish-Christian encounter, every intra-Jewish discussion of Christianity, and every intra-Christian discussion of Jews and Judaism in the decades which followed the war, certainly in Europe and in Israel, and with implications all over the world. It is hard to understand the process of reconciliation and the development of dialogue without this historical context. Jewish-Christian dialogue has been for many decades a post-catastrophic conversation, part of the encompassing effort to delineate a new future for destroyed Europe, to create new pacts, to recover morally from the bloodshed which flooded the continent. For Catholics, the dialogue with the Jews belonged also to the greater endeavor of re-examining the Church's role in the modern world, of broadening and opening Catholic perceptions of non-Catholic others, and the diversification of the relationships with them. For Jews, dialogue with Christians provided vital support for the breaking of the dark anti-Semitic mirror through which Jews have been seen previously, and the establishing of collaborations instead of seclusion. Secularization was another connecting factor against the forces which came to undermine tradition, religion altogether. Jews and Christians suddenly found themselves on the same side of history. The rivalries of the past were less significant than the common denominators of the present. This is the source of the now common concept of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is, of course, a novelty. New constellations encouraged a renewal of both traditions and the reorganization, one in relation to the other. What were the implications of this historical process for theology? The transforming conditions made room for unprecedented theological discoveries and explorations which were until then inconceivable. While the historical conditions kept changing, the theological developments which they have nourished went beyond history and deepened their roots within tradition. This is an important point. The new historical and political conditions opened new windows to the past, to what is anchored in faith and, at least to some extent, independent of the tides and ebbs of history. Catholic officials and theologians, in other words, employed a delicate balance between perseverance and change, theological reflection, attentiveness to criticism, and historical and biblical scholarship, amounting in a great wave of scholarly collaboration between Jews and Christians in New Testament studies, rabbinic studies, anti-Semitic studies, and more, enabled both Jews and Christians to find within their own sources existing yet unexplored aspects of their relations. The Jewishness of Jesus and the apostles, Paul's olive tree, the irrevocability of the covenant, these ideas and images were there in scriptures the whole time, but they were buried under many layers of contradictory evaluations: the blinded synagogue, the traitor Judas, the Judenzau, and so forth. The uniqueness of the conciliatory project was precisely in the delicate balance it established between faithfulness to tradition and a willingness to change. This navigation within tradition and the new sorting out of material that is engaged demanded an incredible effort, spiritually, intellectually, emotionally. It also demanded devoted leadership and professionality. But while theological and biblical scholarly efforts reshaped the past and anchored reconciliation within tradition, history did not stop. It never does. The context in which Jews and Christians have been living over the last decades keep changing against our eyes. Outside the realm of Jewish-Christian relations, Catholics have been dealing, on the one hand, with high waves of secularization, side by side with the establishment and the growth of Catholic communities outside of Europe and the United States in the global South, which changes the equilibrium significantly. Jews, apart from healing the unhealable wounds which the 20th century inflicted on them, have been coping with the strange and unprecedented reality of the State of Israel, where Jews were no longer a minority, where the inherent disparities between Jews from diverse backgrounds and with different self-understandings posed difficult challenges of cohesion, and where the conflictual encounter with the non-Jewish other posed and still is posing immense social, political, and moral challenges. Furthermore, both communities today are witnessing the widening cracks in the liberal order, the same order which was at the basis of their dialogue from the outset. The new political and moral status quo, which was built with great diligence on the ruins of World War II, left by World War II, is transforming. Though its scars are still felt, the Holocaust has long gone, and new political challenges are in place. Catholics from Japan, from India, from the Philippines, whom have never met Jews, for whom the Holocaust is not part of their own history, why should they care so much about this Jewish-Christian story? I imagine that my dear friend here, Gavin, would say, we have to care about this because this is doctrine. Because Jesus was Jewish, because the Hebrew Bible is part of the Catholic canon, and because Paul and the current magisterium as well explicitly say that the covenant was never revoked. I agree with what I just put in your mouth. And yet, it seems to me that notwithstanding the urgency of making oneself acquainted with such themes is deeply tied to history, and more specifically to the history of Jewish victimhood in Europe. In cases in which Jewish-Christian relations are not an actual factor, but merely an abstract one, could we really expect of a priest who is preaching on Matthew 3:7, which depicts the Pharisees as a brood of vipers, or John 8:44, which speaks of the sons of the devil, to combine in his sermons knowledge based on biblical studies about Jewish-Christian relations, which will ease the identification of Jews as the enemies of Christ? This requires, which will not ease, which will complicate the identification of Jews as the enemies of Christ. I'm sorry. This requires a highly sophisticated level of knowledge, which is hard to achieve without a sense of urgency, of importance. Without such an intervention, the great achievements of Jewish-Christian studies could be easily marginalized. But the difficulties do not emerge only where Jews and Christians do not meet and do not share a common history. They appear also in places where the encounter takes place in a profoundly different context. For Middle Eastern, and especially Palestinian Catholics, the Jewish-Christian story is indeed relevant, but in a very different form. For them, the critical historical moment is not the Holocaust, which occurred far away in Europe, but the continuous conflict in the Holy Land. They have another history, another story to tell, one that does not necessarily go through Jewish victimhood, but through Jewish power. Should they be obliged to adhere to the same theological stand as their fellow Europeans? To put it differently, how could one maintain a sensitivity to time and place, but still hold the pieces together doctrinally? Questions of context influence the Jewish side of the fence as well. The inner divisions between Jews grow deeper, whether between diasporic and Israeli Jews, between secular and religious Jews, or between right-wing and left-wing Jews. Jewish solidarity today is as fragile as ever. In their relationships with the great diversity of the Jewish world, Catholics could easily find themselves falling into these sectorial traps. Conducting dialogue only with Orthodox Jews implies a preference for the definition of Judaism as a religion, a definition which does not coincide neither with the strong Jewish identity of secular Jews, nor with the halachic understanding of Jewishness. Sympathizing with some Jewish theologians necessarily clashes with alternative, at times obverse Jewish theologies, and so forth. In other words, in order to meet reality, the image of the Jew within Catholic theology has to be extended beyond reasonable limits. Who will be the Jewish partner in Jewish-Christian dialogue in a world of polarized, divided Judaisms? How would Catholics be able not to contribute to these detrimental divisions precisely through their goodwill and friendship? Before concluding, let me mention but one final problem, which for me is the hardest and the most painful. There is no doubt that anti-Semitism is on the rise, and that Jews who live as minority communities, both in Europe as a very small minority and in the United States as a bigger minority, both communities experience anti-Semitic incidents more often than in the past. On the other hand, in Israel, where Jews are a majority, a Jewish radicalism, which brings with it an outright negation of the other at times, including the Christian other, is also on the rise. As much as we would like that, there is no way to circumvent the fact that the Jewish tradition is not more immune to abuse, to chauvinism, and to distortion than its sister traditions, Christianity included, and that power always brings with it certain risks. Naturally, those two detrimental phenomena, those two hates, constantly nourish each other. How does one resist anti-Semitism while not shying away from criticizing Jewish pathologies? How can one hold Jewish victimhood and Jewish victimization without falling into unrealistic projections, into dichotomies about purity and sin, about good and bad? If I have to guess, I would say that these questions will shape Jewish-Christian dialogue in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ben Yohanan. Thank you for your honesty, for having started with an honest statement and have led us through your whole contribution. And I think it's great to compliment each other for achievements. But as you said, we need to carefully consider, and I'm quoting something that you just said, the effort required to maintain this achievement, and even more to further cultivate it. And yeah, you led us, as we said, after Vatican II in what you called the beginning of decades of post-catastrophic conversation, and then dealing with secularization, and entering into this scholarship and reflection, but also the big changes that happened within our not only religious but social communities. And I think I go away, and then maybe during the Q&A session we will have time for this kind of questions, because it was so interesting to hear you saying, what do we do when there is not a real encounter with people of the other communities, but also what do we do when the meeting does exist and it's challenging. So we keep these question marks in our mind, and we transition to Professor Gavin Costa. Gavin has written 8 books on theology of religions, and his last 2 works have focused especially on Catholics and Jews. Vatican II, Catholic Doctrines on Jews and Muslims, and Doctrines about the Jewish People after Vatican II. He has organized 2 major international conferences on the land of Israel, bringing together Catholics in Jerusalem in 2019 and bringing together Catholics and Jews in Rome at the Angelicum in 2021. He has written a poem, Daughters of Zion, on Catholics and Jews that has been set to 10 minutes of music by the English composer John Pickard and performed and recorded in 2020. So next time we should make sure we also have time for a music break. So thank you so much. And the floor is yours, Professor Costa.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you for all of those people who've been working behind the scenes, and thank you to the audience today. So when I was asked to address issues after Vatican II, it felt like this was quite a difficult situation because I didn't want to say anything bland, and trying to address difficult issues in very short bits of time is usually not very good idea. But I asked 2 Jewish friends, what are the issues that you think Catholics never talk about but should be talked about? And fascinatingly, they both gave me the answer, the land. Okay, so that's one of the issues. The second issue I want to talk about, asking 2 Catholic friends what they would like to hear in terms of the future of dialogue, but are not talked about enough with Jews, was mission. So I'm probably designing a talk that's going to offend everyone here, and I apologize. Okay, so just in terms of backdrop, Vatican II used Romans 11:29 in both Lumen Gentium 16 and in Nostra Aetate 4 to reiterate a theme which has become central, that the gifts and the calling are irrevocable. It is the case that Vatican II didn't quite clarify whether these gifts and calling were about what I'm going to call biblical Judaism or rabbinic Judaism, which is what we are living in the context of. That got clarified by Pope John Paul II in Mainz, 17th of November. I just remember that date, not because I've got such a great memory, but it's my birthday. In Germany, when speaking to rabbis, when he identified this covenantal gift with his audience. And you can look at the literature from 1980 onwards, it pours out the gifts that are irrevocable, and the covenant that God has made with the Jewish people is not just biblical Jews, but what I'm going to call rabbinic Jews. In 2015, we have a document which brings, if you like, this kind of incredible acceleration of teaching and recognition to a head. And the gifts, which is the document produced by the Commission of Religious Relation with Jews, technically has no doctrinal authority. It says so itself in paragraph 1, but it tries to put out the issues, and it's fascinating because it holds together 2 tensions that have to be addressed in terms of the future of Jewish-Christian dialogue. And I say have to as a Catholic theologian. I'm well aware that lots of people have different perceptions on the matter. And the 2 teachings that come, if you like, to a very dynamic tension. Number 1, that the gifts and the calling are irrevocable, and therefore rabbinic Judaism is in an authentic covenant with God. Number 2, the Catholic claim, which has been declared as infallible and has been continuously taught by the Church, that Jesus Christ is the Savior for all people. Now hold those 2 together, and you've got tensions that produce questions that must be resolved. So the first question I want to just briefly address is the land. Here is a promise, and it's a topic which is kind of difficult to talk about, knowing what's going on in Israel right now, but it's a topic that has to be addressed. Here is a promise made to the Jewish people that is absolutely central to what Christians call the Old Covenant and Jewish people call the Hebrew Bible. This promise is made with conditions, but it is an unconditional promise. So therefore we read in the text a drama of a people who are called, who in the land, their purpose is to give glory to God, so that the nations might see the light shine from Zion. It is also the case that this promise is a conditional one. So we have also in Leviticus the terrifying claim that the people may be vomited out if they fail in their obligations. But one should emphasize very strongly that that threat is also in the context that this gift is still intact. Now the question which the Pontifical Biblical Commission addressed in 1992 was, does the Old Testament, as it's called, teach this? And they came up with a clear answer, yes, it does. Now, if you put that together with the theme that the gifts and the calling are irrevocable, you have a very clear question on the table: what do Catholics think about this claim? And right now, we are in a position where there are two trajectories. One trajectory evaporates the claim in terms of understanding both the land, the temple, and the promises being embodied in the person of Jesus. The other trajectory, the one that I want to propose we need to think about in conversation with Jews and with fellow Catholics, is that that specific promise can be understood as intact without a whole series of risks. And this is really important. The first risk is that it cannot reduce the understanding of Jesus as the Messiah, the definitive bringer of salvation to the world. This is not in some sense a relativizing, but actually trying to engage with Scripture in the light of the Council's teaching. The second challenge is that does this lead to a kind of messianic endorsement of Israel, which we find in a number of Jewish, Christian Zionist evangelical theologies? And I want to make it clear that the Catholic approach in terms of reading Scripture has certainly backed off from seeing this kind of scenario mapped out with exactness in terms of a historical one-to-one. So I'm wanting to argue, first, that the Christological claims can be kept intact. Secondly, that this doesn't lead to a nationalist, expansionist, and aggressive form of Zionism. I want to also draw here evidence from John Paul II, and perhaps some people might now be surprised and fall off their seats, which is Pope Benedict on this issue, because he sort of gained fame in apparently saying, no, there can be no endorsement of Israel. Both of them in their writing have said explicitly that the Jewish people's return to the land in the context of the State of Israel can be understood as a sign of God's care and love for his people. And I'm wanting to suggest that that kind of theology does find a very important echo in Jewish thinking. Michael Wishgrod, for example, David Rosen, who was here last year, who are not trying to promote a type of Zionism that one might have lots of questions. And in the end, logically, it seems to me, the Catholic position has to have grounds in Scripture and Catholic thinking. But I'm just pointing out that there's this interesting parallel. One of the big objections to what I'm saying, and it must be taken seriously, is the Palestinian people. The Catholic Church has for a long time been very clear in having a fundamental agreement with the Palestinian people, mirroring the fundamental agreement had with Israel in 1993. The Holy See has also recognized a Palestinian homeland. The theology that I'm wanting to propose, I believe, does not come into conflict with that. It requires steps of thinking, but one of the important questions, one of the important challenges in the Hebrew Bible is how the people live justly and righteously on the land. Okay, I'm not wanting to give sermons to Jewish people, but I'm saying if we have this interest, and you did ask us, that's the kind of implication that happens when thinking through. So I conclude by saying, I think there is the possibility of a form of what I would call minimalist, tentative Catholic Zionism, not based on political interests, possibly prudentially not the time to talk about it. But then when is? Because it's never had a peaceful moment in terms of the Middle Eastern history. And the reason I think one has to talk about it in the end is that if you are committed to the discipline of theology, it is a question that has to be addressed. Okay, the second question I want to speak about is mission. And it is a very difficult, problematic, sensitive question. And it will be difficult in such a short time to be adequately sensitive. But this is my assessment of where we are in the conversation, and it would be very interesting, I think, to have this on the table. The two major challenges put to Catholics, and I'm going to be very blunt here. The first one is that if you know a convicted child molester who has serially committed acts against children, do you let them free in the playground? Now, I'm going to draw a preposterous analogy, but I think there's some truth in it. Catholics have been, towards the Jewish people, analogous to a child molester. The atrocious history of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism means that it is quite understandable that there is a deep lack of trust. Vatican II happened just in 1965. We're talking about actually a long, long period of historical shaping of sensibility. So there's a kind of twist in the tale. If you imagine that trying to be missionary towards a group that you have systematically abused, you have no idea of how to do it successfully. Okay, that's a kind of pragmatic issue. But I think there's a more profound and interesting theological issue. If God has made an irrevocable covenant with his Jewish people, the idea of mission, because it gentilizes any Jew, is deeply problematic. This was brought up beautifully by Rabbi Abraham Heschel during the council. When it was leaked in the New York Times what the text would be, Heschel said publicly he would rather return to Auschwitz than convert. And that statement's very profound. It relates to the first point I'm making, but it relates to this point. For his conversion, he would have lost his Jewish identity. Now, that problem's rebounding in terms of Catholic theology to think both about the first, which I think in the light of the Holocaust is preposterous to imagine mission to the Jewish people. But in the light of the recognition of Paul's promise, how do we think about this issue? So I just want to, in the 5 minutes left, offer some thoughts, none of them conclusive. First one would be, we should, keeping up the analogy, learn how not to molest. And I do mean that seriously. It's kind of interesting in the engagement I've had, suddenly being caught short in terms of thinking about my tradition in the way that Karma's talk really brought out very strongly. Secondly, and this is not at all meant in terms of a missionary strategy, but we've got to think out loud. Within Catholicism, after Vatican II, some very small number of Jewish Catholics have said, up until now, we've had to eradicate the Jewishness of being Catholic. How can we be Jewish Catholics coherently? And here, especially since we're in the Angelicum, I point to the incredibly powerful and interesting book by a Dominican, Antoine Levy. Now, you've guessed by his name, his background. Antoine's book is called Jewish Church, and in it, he makes the claim that after Vatican II, the church needs to recover, now listen carefully, the church needs to recover its biblical Jewish heritage, not its rabbinic, because it hasn't got a rabbinic heritage. So this is not a kind of colonialization move. It is actually saying one of the things that has happened in the Jewish-Catholic dialogue is the recovery of Jewish elements at the heart of the church. In fact, the document in 2015, Gifts, speaks about the Church of the Circumcision and the Church of the Gentiles as a qualitative and quantitative definition of the church. So, ecclesiologists stand up. This is actually an internal question as well as a question about relationships with rabbinic Judaism without an attempt to engraft. Third point I want to make, if we use the distinction between biblical and rabbinic Judaism, we also have a rationale for listening humbly, attentively, to what Jewish exegetes are saying about what we call the Old Testament, but the Hebrew Bible. Because actually this is Revelation. This is our sacred scripture. And here are another people shaped by a later tradition, Rabbinic Judaism, reading that same scripture with reverence, with a life that is generated from that reading. So I want to sort of suggest that actually, at this moment in history, the attention to real Rabbinic Judaism is called for, rather than mission, but I am wanting to also say that that deep claim at the heart of the Christian faith won't go away, that Christ is the Redeemer of all women and men. And I want to finish then with pointing out how this tension really is hot, because the gifts makes a statement. This is the 2015 document from the Commission of Religious Relations with the Jews. Paragraph 36, it says that the Jews are participants in God's salvation is theologically unquestionable, semicolon. But how that can be possible without confessing Christ explicitly is and remains an unfathomable mystery. So, unfathomable mysteries are great, but the theologians need to inspect them as well. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Gavin Costa, for, I would say, for having lovingly and graciously stirred our stomachs up, I think, during your talk, and really welcoming to, I would say, hot button issues like the land and mission in your talk. And I think you said, talking about the land, that's a promise made with conditions, but an unconditional promise. And then you mentioned this tension. I mean, we heard many tensions in your talk, and really the effort of navigating and learning how to do that. So thank you so much for your talk. And actually, we have a few minutes for questions, but I think I would use the privilege of the mic right now. Actually, first of all, before handling to our audience, to hear if, considering what you said, your talks, if there is any question you would like the two of you to ask to each other, and just get started from there. I don't know if you're okay with that. Who wants to go first? Wow. Oh, you see? They're ready for that.
Would you allow me to ask a question and add a comment?
I don't know. Yes.
We addressed two topics, both very sensitive. I can't just let it go.
You see, this is going to be a challenging time. Please.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, and it's wonderful. So let's go with your land argument. And I would like to ask that, and I think it connects with what I also tried to put forward. So when you think about the Hebrew Bible concept of the land, the unconditional but comes with conditions, and you think about contemporary Israel, and you think about the thrival of the Jewish people in their lands as something that relates to the promise of the land. If, chas v'chalila, how do you translate chas v'chalila? God forbid. If, God forbid, bad things happen on the land of Israel, in the state of Israel, and chas v'chalila, Jews will no longer be able to live there.
the biblical consequences of your argument would be to think about this as divine punishment, which will bring us right back to anti-Judaism. So that's my question. Should I go with a comment now about mission?
Good
Okay.
luck, Gavin.
Oh, about mission.
About mission.
That's two questions.
No, it's a comment. The second is a comment.
Oh, right, okay.
Going with your fantastic analogy of the child how do you say that?
Molesting.
Molesting. My husband is a social worker, and he often works with people that are going through restoration, going back to society after these sort of incidents, after being convicted in child molestation, whatever. And the instinct of society, even of their social works, of their therapists, they don't want to treat them. They can't. There is something. I mean, you can say in certain societies, it's like a mark of Cain, right? You don't go back to society in significant ways. In the United States, it's like that, as far as I know. But even if you don't have the legal issue, there is something that, instinctively, and when you raise this issue, it is as if, okay, the past is already in the past, and now we can just talk about it. But it's not exactly like that, because the sensitivity is still there. It's still, so yeah, that's my comment.
The comment is also a question. So you're right. I mean, we look at the period in the 70, when we have the collapse of Jerusalem and the sacking and the removal of the Jewish people. And if we look at the two different traditions interpreting that, we have a growing narrative within the Christian tradition that this is the punishment of the people for rejecting the Messiah. In the Jewish tradition, we have another strong tradition understanding this as a punishment. But I think both of those at some level also raise a more profound question behind it, which is about providence. That if history is in the hands of an all-powerful, loving God, there is a sense in which, at least in terms of the Catholic position, having to say that even in the greatest tragedy, even in the greatest suffering and catastrophe, this must be somehow in the hands of God. And I think there's a parallel type of response within Judaism. So I don't think my proposal necessarily, if, God forbid, we have the scenario you talk about, it gets read in those terms. But on the other hand, it seems to me it's a kind of question for both Jewish interpreters, religious interpreters, to address what would be happening if that happens. In terms of the logic of my position, I'm not entirely, I think, there's a whole new level of interpretation in terms of New Testament materials to reflect on that particular, sorry, when I turn round, does this, the voice go? So it's a danger. But I also think it has to be a real question. You're living in it, and you're seeing what's happening. And there's a question, a friend of mine who's not religious at all said, well, this comes from not trying to get peace, but to destroy another people. This is an issue that's alive in Israel today. The important point from my approach on the theological side, and remember the Holy See has an agreement and a support of Israel as a nation with a right to exist, is to have that support in place and be a friendly critic. But I take your point. Just on the molester, you know, like limitations of analogy, and your husband's right. People have serial abuse issues. You're going to ask a question, is there something in their DNA? And that's the question that I think we're facing. And my thought is, no, there isn't. Because what Vatican II does is it tries to address the element which was not DNA, but deeply lodged in the blood system of the deicide charge. And I'm saying it's not DNA because councils cannot overthrow DNA teachings. And this is the big debate about the council. Did it make a U-turn, as some people argue, or, as I would wish to argue, it was recovering a biblical tradition, Paul, and removing a tradition of deicide which had no magisterial authority behind it. Now, this is an internal Catholic, let's get this right. You know, it sounds like, come on, what you've done. But I'm saying that it's very important to make those distinctions, to think about it from a Catholic viewpoint. But let's see, history will show whether here am I being too complacent and it's a deeper DNA than I recognize.
Your turn.
My turn. Okay. It's very interesting, the whole issue about revisiting our tradition, and this is precisely the point you raised in your talk there and in your question. Is there an element in the tradition that, if you like, sets about a DNA that's destructive of the other? Yep, that's roughly what I think is at stake. From your book, I learned something remarkably interesting, that perhaps there's an element of DNA within the Jewish tradition which now, because of the safety of Israel, now because of the non-persecution of Christians for Jews when they think out loud, is the emergence of anti-Christian rhetoric based on an allegiance to a perceived tradition. So this is not me trying to score a point. I'm just trying to say, how significant is this? Because when I am reading the news right now, it is actually the religious right who have far more power than they ever have in terms of the Jewish state. And therefore, how much is there in those groups, which is a kind of toxic level for the types of conversations, especially when in some forms of religious Zionism there is an attempt to remove the blemish from the land of idolatry, which would include Christians. Very minority group, but with the birth rate as it is in Israel, is it going to be a minority group?
Okay, so we were asking tough questions today, I think. I don't like the use of DNA in either case. I think, especially after the biological discourse of Nazi anti-Semitism, we can no longer speak with these metaphors without falling into these traps. And I think, moreover, I'm not sure the traditions have DNAs. I think they have very solid spaces, cultural spaces, which are preserved by communities, and they can change and adapt to specific historical and political conditions. So something stays and something changes, but you can't really put a spot on what is the hardcore that will never change. I'm not sure we can do that at all. Also, yeah, so one thing, I think certain sources, difficult sources that exist within the Jewish tradition surface. They have no preferable claim for authenticity over other parts of the Jewish tradition. And I would say similar things about the Christian tradition as well. So that's one thing. The other thing is in terms of birth rate, I think this discussion is also, problematic on similar terms, because people change and communities change. And this idea of a population simply preserving the ideas of the parents, it doesn't work. If you take history seriously, then of course the same language and the same sources will still serve these communities because this is how tradition works, but you don't know what they will do with that. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having already engaged in some tough questions, and now it's your time. So I already see people getting ready for questions.
Okay. So thank you so much for your talks. I have a question primarily for Dr. Da Costa, but I think both speakers can actually address this issue.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Maybe, sorry, okay. My name is Thomas Catoy. I'm a professor of Interreligious Dialogue in Berkeley, California. I'm here for one semester. So I wanted to ask a question about, recovering the biblical, the tradition of the Bible. As you mentioned Antoine Lévy's book, which is a very helpful sort of insight. Of course, Christianity has this very long tradition of actually interpreting and the Jewish textual tradition. We have this sort of endless tradition from, the period of the Church Fathers, sort of reading the Old Testament, from a Christological perspective. And of course, there is this sort of asymmetry because, you don't have quite as developed Jewish tradition of reading, for instance, the New Testament in the same way. So my question is there still room for this sort of Christological, traditional Christian reading of the Old Testament, as we try to recover, our sort of Jewish biblical tradition, or is it just going to be an obstacle for mutual understanding?
Sorry, I have a slight hearing difficulty, and because of the light, I can't see your face so well, Thomas. So would you just summarize?
Or if I heard you correctly, you were asking about the long tradition of interpreting from a Christological perspective.
The Old Testament.
The Old Testament.
Yes, and whether there is still room for that today, or is it going to be an obstacle for mutual understanding? Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting in the preface to the 1992 document of the Pontifical Biblical Council, Cardinal Ratzinger, as he was then, writes the preface to it, and he addresses this particular point. His concern is that one can't lose the Christological reading of the Old Testament. This is the heart of how Christianity understands itself. The issue is whether it is possible to continue that while also respecting another community's authentic reading. Now, in the PBC, the reading is not authentic, needs to be glossed. The PBC makes the claim that here is a community reading the text, the Hebrew Bible, from a different paradigm, and it is justified in doing so. I mean, both readings can't be authentic or valid, because there is a central concern about what happens outside of the text in terms of the figure of Jesus. But I think the allegorical, the typological, all these methods of reading that text can't simply be abandoned or jettisoned. What has to then happen is to ask the question, do those readings eradicate the reality of Israel and the Jewish tradition, or can they be returning to the sources, read and gained from without that particular hermeneutic? And I think it's important that the tradition in its changes, I'm kind of struck by Karma's thing that there can't be a DNA. There is an element, I think when thinking about Catholicism, that there is an element of DNA, and that can't be rid of. But the DNA is constantly understood in different interpretative ways. So after the council, we're being asked, to reread these texts without replacement theology. So I would see your question as saying, is replacement theology intrinsic to Christological readings? And I don't think it is.
Thank you.
So much, and I think we have one question here, and then we have Father Andrew here in the middle. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. My name is Menachem Loberbaum, and I'm teaching now at the Angelicum. I finished teaching. I'm a professor at Tel Aviv University. I want to continue Thomas's question, but in a slightly different vein, because towards Gavin, you were using the notion of rabbinic in a very specific form. Now, of course, being Christian means that the rabbinic canon is not part of that tradition. That's clear. But after we have the Hebrew Bible put before us, we're necessarily engaging in Midrash. What does St. Paul do but that? The Gospels are that. So I think that when we think about utilizing the divine word as it appears in the Hebrew Bible as a point of departure for our traditions, we have, I think we have a hermeneutic in which we meet very profoundly, without a strong claim about the thickness of our particular ways of standing before God. So I think we can fine-tune the notion of rabbinic here to serve our different traditions in a very respecting manner, and one that actually, I would argue, grows profoundly out of a notion of covenant.
Of covenant. Is there, are you asking a question right now to Gavin to comment on that, or? Okay.
Whatever, Gavin.
Well, can I just say very brief? It's the reason I introduced the distinction, and I agree with you totally. It's blunt and it's quick. Is biblical Judaism, in the sense of the Old Testament for Christians, is its own heart. Those same scriptures, although arranged differently with different books and read with a different hermeneutic, then get read by the Jewish people, and rabbinic I was using to distinguish simply from biblical, so that we didn't have a kind of compositing, so that it is possible for Christians to look at rabbinic Jews and not put them in the box biblical Jews full stop, but that there is an interpretive tradition that then happens which makes them different. But I think the whole issue of how to read the texts, I'm sort of stipulating it, and it's hardly begun. And I said to Thomas quite boldly, I don't think that Christological readings necessarily eradicate Jewish specificity, but that's to be seen. And it can only be seen when the readings happen. Now, there's a Jewish interpretation of the New Testament, set of volumes that are remarkable. And there is something that needs to be done in a systematic, parallel way of reading the Hebrew Bible through the lens of what one might call post-supersessionist. But again, that's a difficult term, because I think Christianity is soft supersessionist and has to be. but post-hard supersessionist. It's a challenge. But so thank you.
So much, and we have Father Andrew.
Yes, my name is Father Andrew Dalton, and first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to Elena and to both speakers, and just the atmosphere that's here. I think the dialogue that is put on display is a testimony to the good work of the John Paul II Center, because this is the kind of thing that bears fruit. But I also think that it's such a challenge to do authentic dialogue where you're not talking past each other. And I think perhaps the previous question went in this direction too, because although we might have the same vocabulary, we might not have the same dictionary. And there were a couple moments today that I thought that kind of thing was happening. And full disclosure, I wrote my doctorate on fulfilled Israel, Matthew's Plerixis paradigm. And so I'm coming from a perspective of fulfillment theology. I think specifically of Matthew 19:28, where Jesus uses the term Israel to say, in the palingenesia, that is in the resurrection, in the regeneration, in the new world, in the new creation, in the messianic era, pick your translation. And then he specifies what that means. When the Son of Man sits at his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So for us as Catholics, as Christians, we understand Israel to be something post-ascension, actually. It's a reality that isn't merely a word to predicate something of old, but something we live presently. And so a starting point, it seems to me, if we're not going to be talking past each other, equivocation, is to define our terms. And we may have to come to a place where I can say, I'm going to use this term in a way that I know you can't possibly accept. I'm so sorry about that, but words can't live with them, can't live without them. I'm going to define my terms for you in this way. Oh, full disclosure. I recognize that you have this other term. Am I understanding you rightly? And so, for example, with the land, this is a typical example. Like in the Old Testament times, they had certain dimensions, and I think we would see eye to eye on that. The question is, now that Jesus is risen, and okay, his throne is in heaven, his earth is his footstool, and he sends us to the ends of the earth to govern, I would say that Israel, the extension of Israel, keeps pace with the fruits of the Great Commission unto the ends of the earth, such that if you're in Ohio, you're in biblical Israel, from a Catholic perspective. Fulfilled Israel. But this is my question with regard to dialogue. Are we defining our terms charitably, ready to have the other define those terms differently, and then continue the conversation in a dialectic so that at least we have mutual understanding? Are you seeing this happen as practitioners of this? I'm so curious about this. This summer, I'll be bringing a group of seminarians to Israel, and I want them to have that encounter. And I lament that we don't have occasions like this one, where we get to see a friend across the table from another faith perspective, but then really in love, work out these questions. Are you seeing this? Is there hope for us in this? That's my question.
Thank you, and maybe we can hear from both of you.
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my mind around this question. I would say that sometimes it's possible, but when you were now introducing a really fascinating theological account that you've been engaged with, I was wondering how many Jews would even be able to follow. Because the language and the questions that you're asking are so deeply Catholic that in a way it's, when you're trying to make room for Jewish epistemology within this perspective, the framework remains, so the entire meta curiosity that you have is framed through a very Catholic epistemology. I think to a great extent, and this is only talking about the Catholic part in the dialogue. We could say similar things, I think, about well, maybe not similar things, but things about Judaism that also make the dialogue, to a certain degree, a conversation between deaf. I think it's fair to say that sometimes it's the case, even though both parties may have good intentions and also a very critical approach towards their own tradition, trying to open up and to change things in a way that would not be antagonistic towards the other. But there still is an internal discourse, because you know as a Catholic what makes the problems within your tradition, and then you can twist things there and change things there and revisit other traditions in order to clean up the problems that you sense in your own epistemology of the other. But this doesn't mean that the other will understand you and that you will be in conversation with it. So sometimes it seems to me the case, and in a way I think also that our own dialogue is going along these lines, because you have the Jewish person talking about politics and history, which is very often the case, and then the Catholic talking about doctrinal issues and questions of universality of Christ. And so it's really, not, you see that it's not even the same concerns that we are having. But I do think that each of these conversations and each of these concerns is not only legitimate, but it's very important, because part of being able to collaborate and to become friends and to discuss and to argue is also about being able to reflect on our own traditions and our own concerns, and to see where these things also clash sometimes. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you. Do you have any comment?
Just very briefly, Boston is Israel. Yeah, your example. The promise of that specific gift is actually made to the Jewish people. Gentiles reading the scripture, like me, join with you in recognizing also this wider perspective of a kingdom. But my question is, does that eradicate the specific promise made to the Jewish people? Now, when it becomes further complicated is when you have Jewish Catholics, like the famous priest who returns to Israel and claims a right to return after having Brother Daniel, very famous for having saved Jews, celebrated in Yad Vashem, and he himself was a Jew. So when he returns to Israel as a Carmelite priest, makes the claim for right to return, gets that refused, goes to the High Court make a decision, then you've got a very interesting question. I mean, the High Court is the High Court. Is his claim as a Jewish Catholic connected with the land a legitimate one? I would answer yes, in terms of the logic of where I am trying to rethink it. Jewish people will disagree with that, or at least the High Court will disagree with it. Interestingly, I think there was a recent poll taken in terms of secular Jews, the majority in Israel, didn't have a problem with it. So the same Father Antoine Levy that I mentioned wrote a very interesting piece in a Jewish newspaper arguing why is this not possible in the present time. But I think scripturally, the point you're making, totally serious, for Gentiles, there is actually a distinct and different way. This does not evaporate the particular promise of the land. And it doesn't evaporate that promise either for Jews who have become Christians or Catholics.
Thank you. And I think I've seen two hands, but we're already actually past the time that we should have been together. So I would ask the two very, very last people, and it's here, Father Joseph, just to be very quick addressing your specific question, and I would ask then our speakers to briefly give their reply. And please, Father.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to formulate this. I guess more addressed to the doctor there. You mentioned the tension between the Catholic belief that there's no salvation outside of Christ and the recognition that the promise made to the Old Covenant is valid, made to the chosen people is valid. My question is, what then are we trying to do in the dialogue between Roman Catholics and Jews? Because if we believe that as Catholics that Christ is the fulfillment of the law, is the perfection of the law, and that he raised the bar, you have heard it said this, but I say to you, how can we not as Catholics try to evangelize or use the word mission if we truly believe that Christ is a fulfillment of the old law? And I mention that because I have a friend who's Jewish. We're very good friends, and with him I visited him, and he says things and does things, and I'm like, my neighbor did this, and I did that to him, and this guy in work did this, and I did that to him. And I one time said to him, I said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And he said, that's right. Now, I'm not trying to generalize that all, I don't know, but the thing is, I saw sort of a limited, keep the Ten Commandments, you do to them what they do to you, and that's enough. Whereas I think our Christ, our Lord, is giving us a higher standard, and how can we not, as Catholics, in the dialogue, aren't we in some ways trying to bring our Jewish brothers and sisters to see the higher standard that Christ brought?
Thank you, Father. I think that this will be for Gavin, and the last question to Father Joseph.
Okay, thank you all very much. Also, these questions. Mission. The Catholic Church has taken very officially the view that mission cannot be trying to convert Jews to Christianity or to the Catholic Church. Now, Pope Francis in recent times speaks often about, in Italian, missionarietà, which in Romance languages is translated very literally. In English or German, there's difficulty how to translate that. But it's translated a missionary dimension. Now, I think that the term mission in Catholic speak has, for Jewish ears, acquired a very bad name. Can it be, can some form of missionarietà, that is going out to the other, where Pope Francis underlines in recent speeches, it does not mean proselytism, but it means to be open to the other, as other, not as someone to be integrated with us. Can we sanitize the language? In other areas, any organization that respects itself has to have a mission statement. Can the Catholic Church have a mission statement?
Thank you so much. And I just leave the room for a quick thought to our panelists.
I can quickly. Okay, so question there. Sorry, it's like looking into the bright light of heaven up in that corner. So I would. The notion of fulfillment is in relation in the New Testament. We have two themes important. One is, I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And therefore the understanding of fulfillment is not the abolishing of it, but the understanding that Christ in some way opens this covenant to the Gentiles. What we find in the New Testament after Jesus' death is the opening up of the covenanted relationship that is primarily Jewish, but now the Gentiles can come in. That raises all sorts of other problems for this kind of conversation. But the point about rabbinic Judaism is that it's not just frozen biblical Judaism. The question is, so how do you, men and women, understand the law? How do you live by it? This is a conversation that has to be had with the real Jews in front of us, not biblical Judaism. But no way am I wanting to backtrack from, I think, the more fundamental point you're making, which is the claim that Jesus Christ is salvation for all people. In terms of causality and in terms of the Catholic teaching of the necessity of faith in Christ, which is why the gifts, paragraph 36, ends up with a kind of head-on tension that has to be resolved. So the point I do want to stress, though, it doesn't simply just evaporate Judaism to have the truth of the Catholic Church. If I quickly, I know we're running out of time, to Father Joseph's question here, I honestly, as a scholar, am not sure that the Catholic Church has just said no mission, because in gifts there is a confused, in my view, reading. It says no institutional mission. Definitely not. But witness is inevitable. One paragraph further, it says witness is mission. So it seems to me that the statement of 2015 is saying, if you speak as a Catholic to anyone, you are inevitably witnessing to the truth of your faith. In brackets, we can call this personal mission, not institutional mission aimed at the Jewish people. Okay, that's all right. But I think the sense in which one can't, the only engagement with dialogue is the love of truth and learning it from others. So I'm with you on that. But I think this prohibition is an uncomfortable one, because I know Catholics have become Jews through conversation or have left the Catholic Church. You have to be open to the risks of genuinely hearing what the other has to say. So there's an intention which is not necessarily conversion or instrumentalizing the other person, but I'm not quite sure about a kind of prohibition on saying, yeah, I think this is the truth and the life, ...
Thank you, Gavin. And the final word from Karma.
I would also like to refer to your comment, simply because the eye for an eye thing is actually, it has a long tradition and a very difficult one, this specific sentence. Because when we talk about, the pre-conciliar moment, there was this image of the legalistic Jew that, that reads everything very literally and thinks in terms of revenge. And this God that is very wrathful, and so sometimes the classical negative perception of the Jew was exactly because Christian identity was recognized as something that has to be set against the background of the Judaism that came before that. And so in a way, I think it is important, first of all, to remember that in rabbinics, in rabbinic literature, it's already very clear that an eye for an eye is not taken literally. Within Judaism, it's always, talking about money, about compensation, not about actual. So that's one thing, but it seems to me that perhaps part of also the danger that lurks in this affirmation of a fulfillment theology would be that somehow you need to point to the lack of Judaism in order to affirm the novità, right? The novelty and the importance of Christianity. I'm not sure that this is necessarily the case. We can discuss this. But it seems to me that when you want to affirm these slightly conservative approaches, you have to take into account that you flirt with these sort of ideas, which are also part of the preconciliar tradition, and perhaps also part of what we wanted to put to the side. Just to
Thank you. You will be left with the curiosity of what Professor Gavin Costa would have said to Professor Karma Ben-Yohanan, and you can follow us in our next episodes on our Netflix series. But thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our two speakers tonight for this session. And a big thank you to Father Thomas White, to the Angelicum, to the JP2 Center, and to all people who worked behind the scenes for making this event happening. And to all of you who attended, your great questions, and the people who followed us online on the YouTube channel. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Yeah, very.